Okay. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jorge Torres Almazan. On behalf of the Universidad Pedagógica Nacional, we want to welcome you to this session. We want to thank Mr. Chomsky for accepting this invitation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chomsky. Before we start, I'd like to give a little bit of a context to the audience. This is an activity we planned a long time ago. A few months ago, when I was checking the plans and the contents for my class here at the university, the psycholinguistics class, I saw that some of the contents are related to Mr. Chomsky's theories and research. So I decided to contact Mr. Chomsky to explore the possibility of having him on one of our classes. So he accepted, and we planned for May 15. Unfortunately, in that time, Mr. Chomsky didn't feel well, so we had to postpone, and here we are. And here we have some of our students, and they are going to listen to Mr. Chomsky as well as the rest of the audience from many other places, because many people are interested in this. So, Mr. Chomsky, welcome to Tampico. Welcome to Mexico. This is a virtual welcome. Thank you for being here with us. We're going to start with this, but we have to follow the protocol. I know everybody knows Mr. Chomsky. You know who he is, because he's one of the most famous person in the world. But let me go to the official introduction, let's say, okay? Okay. Can you please close your microphone? Whoever has the microphone open, please. Okay. Just let me just go like this. Consider the founder of modern linguistics. Noam Chomsky. Chomsky is one of the most cited scholars in the modern history. Among his groundbreaking books are Syntactic Structures, Language and Mind, Aspect of the Theory of Syntax, and the Minimalist Program, each of which has made distinct contributions to the development of the field. He has received numerous awards, including the Kyoto Prize in Basic Sciences, the Helmholtz Medal and the Ben Franklin Medal in Computer and Cognitive Science. Chomsky introduced the Chomsky hierarchy, generative grammar, and the concept of universal grammar, which underlies all human speech and is based on the innate structure of the mind and brain. Chomsky has not only transformed the field of linguistics, his work has influenced fields such as cognitive science, philosophy, psychology, computer science, mathematics, childhood education, and anthropology. Chomsky is also one of the most influential public intellectuals in the world. He has written more than 100 books, his most recent being Requiem for the American Dream, the 10 Principles of Concentration of Wealth and Power. Chomsky joined the University of Arizona in fall 2017, coming from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he worked since 1955 as professor of linguistics, then professor of linguistics emeritus. And this is Mr. Chomsky. Mr. Chomsky, thank you very much for being here with us. As I said before, we're going to start with the questions and to listen and learn from the expert, Mr. Chomsky. Here we go for the questions. This is question number 1, Mr. Chomsky. Are we born ready to learn languages?
If we weren't born ready to learn languages, we would never learn languages. We have to have the basic principles as part of our nature. Otherwise, it's simple to acquire them. In fact, we now know that infants begin to acquire their native language even before birth. There is some level of intra-utero learning. 2 or 3 day old baby, who the first age when you can begin to test anything, there's reactions you can test, can distinguish between the language of its mother and another language, both spoken by a bilingual woman whose voice it has never heard. By now that's been investigated in some depth understanding of the properties that are involved, mostly prosodic properties, pitch and tone, that distinguish languages from one another, groups of languages. It goes by groups, of course, not the individual language. Then there's a regular course of development, almost reflexive. By about 2 or 3 years old, the child has essentially mastered the essentials of its language, far beyond anything that exists. The child at that point may be producing 2-word utterances like mommy, milk, or something, but actually it's understanding a great deal more. And it's indeed, then it simply flowers from that point. We know that there's extremely little evidence. By now there are studies of statistical studies of the evidence available to children. It's very so they're essentially, what we're essentially seeing is the flowering of an internal capacity, slightly modified depending on experience. So it's going to be a little different if it's Spanish or Japanese or English, but we now have good reason to believe that at the core, the languages are very much the same. Can maybe simply illustrate by having a look at what in fact is the most fundamental and in many ways quite surprising property of language with many consequences. It's called the principle of structure dependence of rules. So an infant of, say, 2 years old, it's been now shown, understands that it must disregard 100% of what it hears and pay attention only to structures that its mind creates. We see this in many illustrations. I'll take a very simple example. Take the sentence, either John or John and the boys, John and Mary are here, but not John and Mary is here. The agreement of the verb copula is not with the closest element, but rather with the construction. And this leads to strange conclusions. So for example, if I say the bombing of the cities is a crime, not are a crime. Cities is the closest noun to the verb, but you don't listen to it. The bombings of the city are a crime. Again, you don't pay attention to the closest noun, but to a remote one. This involves a rather complex computation that looks at the structures that the mind creates and disregards the linear order of the words. It leads to, there are many more complex examples. So simply to give another one, suppose I say the men who fix the car carefully pack their tools. That's ambiguous. It can mean fix the car carefully or carefully pack their tools. If I put the word carefully at the front, it's different. Carefully, the men who fixed the car.
Carlos, porque ellos solo habían prestado dinero y nunca se los había pagado. Entonces, pero eso es...
Please, sorry.
Then it can only mean they carefully packed their tools. The adverb carefully does not look for the closest verb, but it actually picks the more remote one. Carefully, the man who fixed the car packed their tools. Well, again, the interpretation and use of the sentence is looking at the structure and ignoring the linear order of words. This leads to even to consequences where there are things you just can't say because it doesn't work. But all of that the infant knows with no experience. It knows that it ignores 100% of what it hears, linear order of words, disregards that, pays attention to what it never hears, the structure that the mind creates, and operates on that. That's known with no evidence, and it has many consequences for the nature of language. All constructions in all languages, all rules in all languages abide by this principle. That's a striking example of how acquisition of language is really the use, the flowering of internal principles, stimulated, triggered by experience, like other instinctive structures, and partially, but in a very limited way, shaped by experience. As far as we know, all of language is like this. So the answer to the question is, we're born to learn. Some of the most interesting current work on language is bringing forth the internal principles, which turn out to be quite simple and fundamental, that lead to consequences like this. But it's universal across the board. These are human, distinctive human characteristics. It's a species property. All humans, to our knowledge, share all of these capacities with essentially no difference, and it's unique to humans. There's nothing analogous whatsoever in the animal world, I think, is the current state of our understanding.
Thank you, Mr. Chomsky. Again, as I told you, our students are here, and the idea was for them to listen directly from you, all these answers to these questions. The following question is this one, Mr. Chomsky. How do children apply grammatical rules to words for language to words for which their language makes exceptions, for example, fish and fishes?
There's extensive research on how children acquire what we call irregularities. So think, thought, instead of think, thinked, and so on. Turns out that there's what's called a kind of a U-shaped curve. At the earliest stage, children...
Have you read about Noam Chomsky?
Noam Chomsky?
Yeah.
Please turn off your microphones, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Chomsky, go ahead. I'm sorry about that.
At the earliest stage, maybe 2 years old, children tend to use the irregular cases the same way that the community around them does, their parents, their friends, and so on. They get it the right way. Then they go through a period when they get them wrong. They use the rules which overgeneralize. So they'll say, think, thinked, instead of think, thought. Then at a later age, they go back to getting the forms used the way they spoke the language around them does it. It's by now, there's been a lot of work on how this happens. I go through the details. If you're interested, there's pretty much solves the problem.
¿Quieres la lista de precios? Ahorita te la mando.
Olimpia, por favor, el audio. I'm sorry, Mr. Chomsky.
The most outstanding work on this, which pretty much solves the problem, is a book by Charles Yang called The Price of Productivity, where he gives a very precise way to explain exactly this course of procedure and how the decision is made by the student reflexively, unconsciously, to choose when to apply the grammatical rules and when not to.
Thank you, Mr. Chomsky. Let's go to the following question, everyone. This is the other one. How is learning language different to mathematics or biology or history, for example?
Well, in the case of mathematics, we have to make a distinction, which in fact mathematicians make, the distinction between arithmetic and the rest of mathematics. There's a famous comment by a highly regarded mathematician, Kronecker, who once said, God created the numbers, man created everything else. What he means is, of course, the number system, basically arithmetic, is just innate to us. It's part of our nature. The rest of mathematics is created by humans. And in fact, we acquire them very differently. The basic of arithmetic, you simply have to know. If you don't know it innately, you can't acquire it. The rest of mathematics, we study the way we study physics or chemistry. Something created has to be acquired by study. The basis for arithmetic turns out to be very similar to the basis for language. And it's very possible that both language and arithmetic originated from the same fundamental principles. If this is correct, it would answer a problem that very much concerned Charles Darwin and the co-founder of the modern theory of evolution, Wallace, his co-founder and associate. Two of them basically, Alfred Russel Wallace, the two discovered the basic theory of natural selection at the same time. And they were very much concerned about a curious fact, namely, it seems that all human beings without experience seem to know arithmetic, the basis of arithmetic. They know that the numbers go on forever and that 2 plus 3 is the same as 3 plus 2 and so on. And they were very naturally concerned about this because it couldn't have been selected. It was never used in the whole history of human beings. This knowledge was never used until very recently, and even recently by a very small proportion of the population. So it couldn't have been selected, but it's uniform among people. And the possible answer is it's simply an offshoot of the linguistic capacity using the fundamental principles of language. That's controversial, but it looks like it might be possible, and it would answer the Darwin-Wallace paradox and would also account for how it is that infants automatically know the basis of arithmetic, which can't possibly, there's simply no way to learn it.
Thank you, Mr. Chomsky. Thank you for that wonderful answer. Let's go to the following question in here, everyone. This is the other one, Mr. Chomsky. Some languages have the basis of subject, verb, and object structure, but some don't. Does this mean that there are different language acquisition devices?
Well, let's take a look at SVO. There are Languages are divided, if you look at them, between SVO languages and SOV languages, object preceding the verb. There are very few others. There are few VSO languages, but they probably have to do with the raising of V, which we find in the SVO languages too. So, will John leave, not John will leave. We've raised V to the higher position. In the other Germanic languages, German, the verb goes to the second position normally, even in declarative sentences. So the VSO languages are probably really either SOV or SVO. There's very rare languages which have the object first. Several languages of the Brazilian Amazon, but very rare. It's almost always either SVO or SOV. And if you think about it, we already have the answer to that in what I suggested before. Language, the infant knows that ordering doesn't matter. Linear ordering doesn't matter. All that matters is structure. We see that in the structure dependence. Here's another example. So the SVO languages are actually SVP languages. It's the subject and then the verb phrase. And the SOV languages are also SVP languages. The difference between them is whether in the VP you have the verb preceding the object or following the object. But the language, the basics, understanding of language doesn't tell you, doesn't give an answer to that question. So there's, in fact, why do we have this ordering at all? Really has nothing to do with language. It has to do with the fact that the articulatory system, which pronounces language, has to put words in linear order. We can't speak structures. We have to somehow put the words in linear order in order to be able to externalize them. Pretty much the same with sign language. It uses the properties of visual space, so it's a little more flexible, but essentially things have to be ordered in order to be externalized. But none of that has anything to do with language. The articulatory system was in place millions of years before language developed. It was just appropriated by language for externalization. And it has never changed since language emerged. So language, the internal system, has to accommodate to some sensory motor system in order to be able to be externalized for others. So there's a question that's simply not answered. The internal language does not order V and O, just says you have a VP structure with both a V and an O. But the articulatory system demands that you order it one way or another. So pretty arbitrarily, languages just pick one or the other. But it's just a matter of the lack of conformity between the internal language and the articulatory system, which requires that some decision be made. There's nothing real about learning. The child can learn this with almost no evidence. If you hear John saw Bill, it's a VSO language, SVO language. If you hear John Bill saw, it's a SOV language. So a couple of examples are enough to set the system running. So there's no different lads and there's barely no learning. It's just overcoming a disparity between the language and the articulatory system.
Thank you, Mr. Chomsky. We'll go to the following question. this is the other one, Mr. Chomsky. What cognitive processes are included in the ordinary use of language?
Well, quite a few. So if any of you have worked on language processing, parsing, sometimes mechanical parsing, you know that there's lots of problems, and they have to be overcome by other cognitive processes. So for example, when you hear the sentence in English or same in other languages, what book did John read? You have to somehow figure out that the object read is what book, even though it's not pronounced in the object position. Now we have quite good evidence that the internal language does pronounce what book in both positions. What the mind is actually hearing is which book John read, which book. That's how the mind is hearing it and interpreting it. But the ear isn't. The lower case of which book is deleted. The reason for that is computational efficiency. It takes a lot of computational power to produce both cases. And in fact, in complex structures, there are many cases. So what the external system does is erase most of them just to save computation. But that leaves problems for parsing and interpretation. You have to figure out somehow what fills the gaps. These are called in the parsing literature filler gap problems. And they're among the hardest problems of parsing and interpreting. So cognitive processes have to be used to somehow figure out what they are. They use background information, all sorts of things. In fact, if you begin to look closely, the problems like this arise at the very earliest stage of interpreting what you hear. If you hear a sentence like, suppose I say, what are you doing? Okay. The way I'd actually say it is, what you doing? So the first thing you hear is, what you. You can't make any sense out of what you. That's nothing. You have to wait for the rest of the sentence to come along, because by which point you can somehow reconstruct what was said initially. Turns out almost everything is like that. If you really listen to the sounds of speech, normal speech, the beginning parts, if they're cut off, are unintelligible. They're just noise. It isn't until later in the sentence that you can actually hear what's being said. Now, we're unconscious of this because it's all done at an unconscious level of processing. But if you set up the experimental conditions so that all but the initial part of speech is cut out, it's just noise, gibberish. So from the very beginning of comprehension, other cognitive processes are involved, and they're pretty complicated ones. And this shows up in many other ways. So memory, for example, has a big effect on what you do. We tend to put more complex structures towards the end of a sentence. If I want to say, it is very surprising to me that John decided to quit college after a year. The underlying structure of that is, I can't remember what I said, that John decided to quit college for a year is surprising to me, but we don't say it that way. We take the long phrase that he decided to quit college and we delay it to the end, because that makes processing easier. It means we can process the simple part, hold off the complex part, use our memory resources and other cognitive processes to deal with the complex part at the end. Well, these are cognitive processes involved just in the use of language. And of course, they're comparably involved in all of the processing of language. So they're all over the place. Language is deeply embedded. The use of language, not language itself. Language itself is separate from other cognitive processes, doesn't relate to them. But the use of language is very much involved with cognitive processes. I should say a word about the separation, beginning with the pioneering work of Eric Lenneberg, who founded modern biology of language, beginning with his work back in the 1960s. It's been increasingly known that linguistic capacity is dissociated from other cognitive processes. Means if, say, some brain damage severely harms linguistic capacity, it may leave other cognitive processes untouched, and conversely, serious damage to other cognitive processes may leave linguistic capacity untouched. The main work on this topic has been done by Susan Curtis at San Diego University. So, and that's what that shows us, many other things, is that language itself seems to be what's called modular, separated from other cognitive processes. But the use of language is deeply integrated with other cognitive processes.
Thank you, Mr. Chomsky. We have a couple more questions. I guess these are more or less the last ones, but the last in this slide, I guess. What does motherese talk have to do with the activation of the language acquisition device? If so, what will be its role?
Well, it's a very common fact about general instinctive processes, say vision, others, that they have to be triggered by something. Once they're triggered, they typically go off in their own way, somewhat shaped by experience. And it's possible that motherese may have a role in triggering the language capacity. As I mentioned, in utero, before birth, the fetus is beginning to acquire some information about the language, obviously, from the mother's speech. But it was thought for a long time that the way mothers talk to children influences their acquisition of language. So mothers and other adults, in fact, tend to talk to children in a higher voice, slowly, and so on. Turns out that has almost no effect, no detectable effect. The child just doesn't pay attention. It picks up language from the ordinary speech around it. That's why, if you think about yourself, I'm sure you can find that you probably speak the language of your peers, not the language of your parents. If you happen to have grown up in an immigrant family like me, I don't speak the way my parents did. Their native language was Yiddish. They spoke English, but with an accent. But I don't speak with that accent. I speak the way the children in my neighborhood spoke. They didn't talk to me in any special way. They just talked. But that's the language you pick up. And by now there's pretty good, strong experimental evidence that the special ways in which adults talk to children don't affect their language. It may affect other things, like their emotional development, their sense of contact with other people, their sense of acceptance into a broader community. It probably has a function. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it automatically. But it doesn't seem to affect the language. So it's conceivable that it affects the activation of LAD, but doesn't affect the way it works. In fact, language acquisition is pretty much of a reflexive act. It's unconscious, it just happens. It happens in the particular ways it does because of the way we're designed. So take again the SVO, SOV example. The fact that it's S verb phrase, that comes from the inside. The fact that it's either SOV or SVO comes from small amount of evidence from the outside. And that seems to be the basic story, even for the meaning of words. So you pick the simplest words that we use, words we use to refer to things: a dog, cat, tree, house, river, whatever you pick. If you begin to look at the meaning of those words, it's quite complex. It's not simple. And infants learn these words, what we call learn the words, on the basis of very few presentations, maybe 2 or 3 presentations, nowhere near, nothing that tells them anything about the meaning of the word. The meaning of the word almost overwhelmingly has to come from the inside. How this is done, nobody understands, but the evidence makes it very clear that that's what happens. So from the meaning of words to the structure of sentences to the principles of grammar, it's all basically emerging from our fundamental nature with some limited modification coming from the outside, like SVO or SOV, or pronouncing the word one way rather than another way. Well, it's a very deep-seated question. Have to go back to the origins of generative grammar. Structural linguistics, which was the structural and behaviorist linguistics, were the reigning doctrines around mid-20th century. And structural linguistics was a very small field at that time. In fact, most of the people knew each other. It was a small professional field. And it had reached very significant and had made a great deal of progress. The great contribution of de Saussure, his most important contribution, I think, was to distinguish sharply between diachronic and synchronic linguistics, the study of the history of language and the study of the nature of language as an existing system. That had never been really sharply distinguished before, but he did distinguish them, and the study of the existing system began to take off in important ways. Anthropological linguistics developed about at the same time, and a great deal of information was discovered about the variety of languages. There were a few principles, the phonemic principle, a few others, but basically the system that developed was a system of procedures that you could use to apply to any collection of data, any corpus of data, and the procedures would identify the elements of the grammar, the phonemes, The morphemes didn't go much beyond that, and organize them, classify them, and talk about their relations and so on. So the field by mid-century defined itself as a taxonomic science, a science that based on procedures of analysis. The most sophisticated procedures were those developed by Zelig-Harris, with whom I studied. Other procedures for phonological analysis were developed by Trubetskoy in Europe, Bernard Bloch in the United States, and others, Edward Spear, and so on. But that was essentially the field. The nature of language was assumed to be a system of habits. Leonard Bloomfield, great American linguist, defined language as a matter of training and habit. You're taught the language by training, you know it by habit. If anything new is produced, it's by what was called analogy, which was never explained. That was essentially the field at mid-20th century. Generative grammar developed basically from skepticism about these assumptions. Several people, actually a few graduate students, I was one, Eric Lenneberg, who I mentioned, was another, Morris Halley, old friend, was a third. The three of us were graduate students at Harvard. I had already started in it earlier. And the three of us were just very skeptical about the reigning doctrines. For one thing, didn't seem to be any reason why linguistics, as distinct from every other field, should be a taxonomic science rather than an explanatory science, one that tried to explain why things are the way they are, when I actually began as an undergraduate in the late 40s to try to construct an explanatory grammar, what was later called generative grammar. It quickly became obvious, not only that the taxonomic approach was very limited, but that it also gave the wrong answers. The procedures of analysis that were used identified elements which were quite different from the elements that entered into an explanatory theory. Well, it's quite obvious from inspection that language cannot be a matter of habit for the reasons I've been talking about. And saying new sentences come by analogy just tells you nothing. What's the analogy? Nothing. So all of that just seemed wrong. Then came the effort to construct explanatory grammars, generative grammars, that automatically leads you to two kinds of theory. One is the theory of a particular language, say English or Japanese or Spanish. That's the generative grammar of that language. But there's a deeper problem. It's a problem about the faculty of language. What is the fundamental shared knowledge of language that allows a child to pick up any language? Because a child can pick up any of them with equal ease. So what's the fundamental internal system? They want to have a theory about that. Well, you go back to the mid-1950s, there wasn't a lot to say about this. The generative grammars, the first generative grammars that were constructed it turned out that everywhere you looked, there were problems, like the problems of structure dependence that I mentioned. But everywhere you looked, everything was problematic. And in order to deal with the problems, it seemed necessary to construct quite complex systems. Early transformational grammars, if you look at them, are pretty intricate. Phrase structure grammar is very intricate. It was clear right away that couldn't be correct, because language has to solve a theory of language, a really genuine theory, has to deal with the problem of evolution. How did language evolve? we now know a lot more than we did then. Turns out language evolved in a very brief period of time. Something like that was understood 70 years ago, but now we understand it quite clearly. So that means whatever evolved has to be pretty simple. But in order for a child to acquire the language, it must be very rich and complex. So there's a conundrum problem. How do you put these two things together? Well, the course of the work, at least the work in linguistic theory for the last 70 years, has been pretty much an effort to deal with this conundrum. We've finally reached a point, I think, in the so-called minimalist approach, where we have some real answers, some deep principles which are simple enough so that they could have easily evolved, even some ideas as to how they evolved, but nevertheless lead, when used in connection with general principles of efficiency of computation, which are basically natural laws, when put together with these, do yield considerable insight into basic principles of language. Structure dependence happens to be one. There's quite a few others. So I think that's, at least from my point of view, that's the main difference between now and then. There are many other differences. I mean, just in the last 20 or 30 years, information about the range of languages and the depth of analysis of description of the languages has just exploded. Take a department like mine at MIT, where I spent most of my life, the world's major department of modern linguistics. You go back about 30 years, any faculty member could be on the dissertation committee for any student. What was known was, I mean, there were specialists, but basically everyone had some grasp of everything. By now, that's totally impossible. Things have gotten so advanced in particular areas that you really have to be can have a general idea and understanding. You can use results from other areas, but to really work on something like a PhD thesis, which goes into it in depth, you really have to have specialist knowledge. Now that's a remarkable change. The kind of change that does take place in sciences as they become more mature. There are deeper, more fundamental principles that emerge, which everyone knows and grasps, but then there's vast amounts of information, depth of insight into particular systems and structures, which you really have to have specialist knowledge of. And the field is moving in that direction. I think it's becoming a more mature science in that respect.
Thank you, Mr. Chomsky. I guess you already answered part of the following question, which is the last. But I'd like you to take a look and see if you can tell us a little bit more on this, because you already mentioned some of these grammars. But as I told you, this is the last question. So what else can you tell us about this? We still have like a couple of minutes before we finish.
Actually, if you look at a book on the theory of computation, it'll run through this. If you look at Wikipedia, look up Chomsky hierarchy, you get a pretty good explanation of this. They're all missing limits. It's kind of interesting, but the article in which I introduced all this, 1956, if you read that article, it does go through all of these, but it argues that all of them are the wrong systems for human language. The reason is not failure to describe the facts, but it's failure to provide serious explanation of the facts. Now that was not considered an issue back in the 1950s. And even today, most of the field just is not interested, just as in, say, biology. Most biologists are interested in descriptions of particular organisms and so on. They don't ask many questions about fundamental molecular biology. But this paper was written from the point of view of the analog to fundamental molecular biology, which is not much developed then. What do we need to explain languages? And in fact, the paper itself is called 3 Models for the Description of Language. And the third model, which has been almost totally ignored, is transformational grammar, which doesn't fall into these systems at all, but seemed at that time to be necessary to try to find real explanations. We can now improve on that a great deal. So one point is these 4 types are of considerable interest, even tell you something about language. But in my view at the time, by now even more so, these are not, language actually doesn't fit into this hierarchy at all. It uses different principles and goes in a different direction. Well, going to these 4 briefly, this is a hierarchy of formal languages. Formal languages are languages that use linear order. All of these formal languages, all of the types, are strings of symbols, one following the other, like every computer language, every artificial language, everything that we hear, one symbol after another. As I've just pointed out, human language isn't like that. It's a system of structures which doesn't use linear order at all. So for that reason alone, it's a different kind of system. Well, nevertheless, the study of linearly ordered systems is extremely interesting. Type 0 unrestricted grammar happens to be something that has a major role in modern mathematics. These are systems that were developed by a great mathematician who showed it to be equivalent to what are now called universal Turing machines. These are, so they're very significant systems. Type 1, which is context sensitive, is very familiar in in the study of ordinary language. It's, say if you have a rule that says a verb it becomes transitive in a certain environment, but not elsewhere. Or in phonology, if you find that in English, say the underlying symbol element k becomes s in a certain environment, like electricity, that's a context-sensitive rule. It says it becomes a change takes place in an environment. Context-free grammar is one where the changes take place without any environment. We're very familiar with that in phrase structure rules. Irregular grammars are the kind that were almost universally used, still are, in engineering applications. Sometimes called Markov sources if you add probabilities to them. It's what's called a finite state system, has a finite number of states. The state of the system is determined in the narrowest case by this last symbol that was produced, in the broader case by K symbols before it. So you look K symbols back and that tells you how to go on. Well, that's the kind of system that's used in almost all engineering applications, or in parsing, other things. So these are the 4 types. There are automata related characterizations of all 4. For those of you who know anything about automata theory, type 0 is, as I said, universal Turing machines. Type 1 is linear bounded automata. Type 2 is non-deterministic push-down storage automata. Type 3 is Markov sources without the probabilities. So there's interesting mathematical theories about that. They also have properties. They bring out properties of languages, but I don't think they're the right systems for languages. And in fact, the basic thrust of the 1956 paper, which introduced them, which has been essentially ignored, is that these aren't the right systems for language.
Mr. Chomsky, we cannot thank you enough. This is a historical event for our university and our city. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much. I'd like to ask you, we can open our cameras and have a picture with you. Is that possible?
Sorry?
So all our audience can
Oh, sure. Please go
and
ahead.
have a picture. Let me just stop sharing. Okay. So please, everyone, if you want, you can open your camera and take a picture with Mr. Chomsky, everyone. All right. Mr. Chomsky, again, thank you very much. We appreciate this a lot. You will be in our hearts and minds forever. This was an excellent and extraordinary experience. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Mr. Chomsky.
Thank you. My pleasure. Glad to have a chance to be with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chomsky. Well, everyone, thank you for attending this event. Thank you to la Universidad Pedagógica Nacional for helping us putting this together. And again, thank you to Mr. Chomsky. See you the next one, everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.